Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be back in this room. I used to sit right there, the front of the class. And this class, when I signed up for it, I literally did not know what the word cartography meant. When I saw it in the course listings, I had to Google it to find out. And in the last 7 years, it's pretty much been my entire life. Making maps every day. As Malcolm Gladwell would say, I've definitely passed the 10,000 hour mark, so hopefully I know a few things, but I still have a lot to learn. But in terms of an overview, I will go through quite a few maps. Uh, I've basically got about 100, 150 maps, but I'm going to try to skip through some of them very quickly and then focus on others that are more exciting or there's something interesting to do with the color or design that I want to highlight. And just in broad strokes, so this is where I started 6 or 7 years ago. At the end of this class, I literally talked to the guest lecturer and got a job a few weeks later at the Human Early Learning Partnership. Some of you may be in the Dr. Blinkenberg's class where Jay Juilliard presented. Has anyone here talked about HELP before? No? Okay, then I'll cover some of that in detail. The other thing I did throughout my career is I've been consulting personally and doing some private work, which as students, I'd encourage you all to market yourselves. You have a great skill, make a little extra money. And then the transition I did 2 years ago was to a consulting firm in Gastown called Boulder Associates. At the time, it was an urban planning firm called HB Lanark, which was bought by Boulder. And I'll talk about that transition. But essentially, there's two types of work I do there, urban planning and environmental assessment. And I'll define those a little more. Last but not least, I also have a blog, and I'll show some of those kind of healthy city maps focused on active transportation and urban design. So, give you a little bit of an intro. I hate text. This is the most text I have on a slide, but just to give you some sort of idea of what my life is like. I ride my bike on the seawall every morning to my office. I have 2 monitors, fancy keyboard, lots of technology to help me do my job. But the business of the job is not physically making maps. I sell myself and the services that I provide to our clients. And those clients are internal, basically the staff that I work with. I have to help them with their projects. And they're also external, or people who come to our firm and say, I need a map. Can you help me? And I say, it'll be $200 an hour, and some of these maps that you're looking at literally cost like $4,000 to produce. So it's kind of silly. At the end of the day, you think of your labs as a lot of work. The reason you do spend so much time preparing is you're essentially, when you get to my level, selling all that knowledge that you've acquired, and it is a very valuable service. Just the sort of consulting side, I have a background in sales, selling bikes for 4 years, so that comes in handy. And if you're going to be in the consulting business, I encourage you to, practice your communication skills. Presentations in class, if you have the opportunity, are a great place to start. And on the technical side, following some of the GIS protocols for database storage, that stuff comes in, it's invaluable in the business of day-to-day work. And the last thing is the budget, and basically I have a fixed amount of money to produce the work that I do, and we have timelines, we have contracts. My company's business is risk. Essentially, we are a third party who does work for other people so that they can sue us if we do something wrong. That's kind of the business of environmental consulting or urban planning in a nutshell. They could hire staff themselves, like the city could hire their own staff, but they would rather hire an external company to do it, partly due to the risk, but partly due to the efficiency of having someone who's an expert to come in and help them out. So slightly less text, but the last thing I wanted to show you, just so that we're all on the same page, I use Esri ArcMap 10.1 and Adobe Illustrator. I don't know if you're using Adobe this.
That's exactly what
Okay.
we use in the lab.
And I also use Google's suite of program, basically just web maps. I use their API, and I don't do a lot of web mapping, so I'm not going to highlight that today. The other thing to note, almost all the data we use is from Canbec, or I think through GeoBase or GeoGratis, and then StatsCan and GeoBC or other sources. That if you're doing your final projects, hopefully today I can give you some inspiration for your projects or some sort of idea, and that's the data that I use for almost everything. And lastly, in BC, if you're doing provincial maps, we use Albert's projection almost all the time. It makes the province look nice. But if we're doing local detailed mapping, like City of Vancouver, we're often using the UTM grid, and UTM 10 is 80% of the maps I make. So that keeps the north, or basically keeps the border nice and flat, and north is to the north. Always use a geodatabase. That's lifesaver if you're doing area calculations with shapefiles. Sometimes the feature attributes are not updated, and you could literally produce entirely erroneous results. And I've done it. It's kind of strange when someone comes back and says, "Why is this project footprint only 12 square meters?" And I'm kind of, it's embarrassing. At any rate, the other thing to note, if you're designing for PowerPoint, I suggest using a 3:4 ratio or 7.5-inch frame. At the first project at UBC, almost all my maps were letter-size paper because that's what we printed. In my urban planning job now, it's almost all tabloid size or larger format, 11:17. And scales, I never really thought much about scales in this class. I was kind of like, why are we putting this number on the page? And ultimately, when I worked at UBC in the kind of data visualization world, scale was irrelevant. But when I work with landscape architects or engineers, scale is the most important thing on the page. So some of the maps you'll see I've labeled it prominently. It says 1 to 1250 or 1 to 5000. And that's because they're using this as a scale drawing to create overlays and design things on top of. And they need that scale as a reference. They actually have rulers that translate inches into kilometers. Color brewer, I'm sure you've talked about, and templates are a lifesaver. You'll see a lot of my maps are using templates. And in another kind of summary, I made this chart. It's not my favorite chart, but the point I wanted to communicate is I've made about 800 maps in the last 6 years. And there's a key distinction I wanted to highlight. When I worked at the Human Early Learning Partnership at UBC, I made approximately 200 maps. These are just the ones I kept, kind of final products in my portfolio. And that was 4.5 years of work. When I work at Boulder, I've been there 2 years and I've made 420. So I've approximately 4 times the number of maps per year. So the consulting business is fast-paced. You get about 10 different projects every week, and you're constantly producing more and more. And you have to just get it out the door. At UBC, it was more about quality and really focusing on every map and making it the best you possibly could. Consulting is kind of that finding the optimum balance where you kind of get to 80 or 90%, make the client happy, and move on. So I have to kind of let go of my perfectionist tendencies, but I'm learning. So the other thing I wanted to really talk about is this idea of what are you actually creating? People often think, like when I say what's my job, I make maps. It's not really what I do. And if I were to say I use GIS or I download data and I transform it and I visualize it, that's how I do it. The really important thing is why. What is it, or why am I doing my job? And each of these maps to me tells a story, and it's basically a way to take a client or a customer's knowledge of a situation. I use my expertise and I help them to come up with a piece of art or a story to help them basically answer the question why. I don't want to repeat all the cartography things Don's taught you, but I just wanted to share a few things to look at as you go through my maps. Contrast, basically you should see things pop out using color, dark, light. Obviously on a black projector, black is light, white is black. But if you print it, black is dark. It's kind of the inverse. I'll show some highlights of that later. Color, basically green. A lot of the emotional attachments we have to color are very important to consider. Simplicity, people often ask me to put everything on one map, and you have to be able to say no. Sometimes you don't need 11 different symbols and 12 different colors with overlays and labels. So you're the experts. Do what you think is best. Break down text into clear and legible symbols. And I will have these slides online after, so if you want to look at these, you can. Work in teams and get your work reviewed. the idea here is I'm not I mean, I'm an expert, but I'm also not perfect, and a lot of other opinions give me great advice. So all my maps are reviewed. Make sure that you design for the end. Basically, start with the end in mind. So think about where your map's going to be shown, who's the audience, how educated are they? Is this a public open house, or is this going to be um, an expert who's a scientist who's going to use the maps for technical data? And last but not least, visual hierarchy in map design is hopefully the most important thing. When you look at that map, you should instantly know what you're looking at, what's the story, what are you focusing on. Some of these maps don't do that very well, and it's hard to tell what the map's about, so you can give me feedback on that. So this one, you immediately know, I did not make this, but this map is about bacon. It's a cartogram. So to summarize, that's a few things that I hope to highlight. I've got about half an hour left, so I'll keep going. This was the first map that got me, it was my final project for this class. So I worked very closely, Don gave me a lot of help, and I think it's still on the wall in the hallway. And it's a lot to look at, but the basic summary that I was trying to communicate was that we're losing forests. This scale on the bottom shows percentage change of forest area over 10-year or 15-year period. And then I was trying to draw a comparison between forest area and the climate or carbon emissions, or climate change carbon emissions resulting from that forest area change. So in a very simple way, it tells a story. Some areas are getting more forests and sequestering carbon, others are cutting down trees and emissions are going. It's actually helped me a lot in the last 10 years. So think about your final projects as job interviews. Take them seriously. The other thing, when I was in undergrad, I used maps for all my classes in 3rd and 4th year. I didn't need to. This was an ecology class. I just decided to map some turtle habitat and try to do an analysis of harmful algae blooms. And I also, in David Lay's class, did an analysis of social geography related to the work that I was doing at the time. So this is this child development data that I was working on. I'll tell you more about. And I also did an honors thesis. So if you're really into GIS, who's loves GIS here? Anyone? Okay, we've got some. I'm a nerd, so just admit it. Some people love it, and I did. So I spent a summer doing this thesis with Brian, basically looking at where do people live in BC and trying to come up with a way to take a normal core clef map where it's area filling, or basically the colors fill the polygons, and refine it to what's called a dasymetric map, which is a way of interpolating the data to be displayed where the people live. So these census tracts, or actually census dissemination blocks, there's no one living on the North Shore Mountains. So if you can hide the data or mask it, you can recalculate the population density and create a better map.
Spec.
Yeah.
So what is that like? Which maps that we looked at? Is that kind of the same idea as we looked at one for all of Canada?
Is it
One of the Stats Can population equity ones, where it was by census division. I think it was
agriculture? Or?
I think it was one about speaking French, but it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter what the variable was. But
Yeah.
when
And the
they kind of
StatsCan, they have the ecumene for the national scale. It's a 1 to 250,000 scale. But when you zoom in, it's like just blobs. They're
right,
not
so
very
it only
detailed.
works at the national
So
scale.
that's why I created this. So come up with an idea, pursue it. I ended up presenting this at several conferences and helped my job out as well. So this was the job that I had at that time. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but in a nutshell, what my job was to collect data, survey data that teachers fill out a survey about kindergarten kids. They basically evaluate their holistic child development, so physical, social, emotional, cognitive, and linguistic. Basically, not just reading and writing, but how's that child doing? Are they coming to school hungry? Are they coming to school stressed or tired? Do they get in fights? We collect that survey data, geocode it to postal codes, and then aggregate those postal codes into neighborhoods. And with that data, we can then create data tables and maps that show what percentage of the children in each neighborhood are coming to school vulnerable. So vulnerability is the data that we looked at. And I don't need to tell you too much more, except I'm going to show you a few more maps. And the key is we did it by neighborhoods, which were local maps, local health areas, um, and then provincially by school district. So the geographies really mattered. We had 3 distinct geographies that we worked with, and we had different cartographic techniques for displaying all the different scales. So provincially, you can snapshot a whole province in a map, start to talk about areas where 35% of kids are vulnerable. We've got a problem, and this is a tool to inspire policy action, to motivate local community groups to get involved. There's a lot of advocacy work and there's a lot to this project. I worked there 4 years and I barely scratched the surface. So if you want to learn more, check out their website, earlylearning.ubc.ca. But at the neighborhood scale, I also got the opportunity to create a lot of cool maps, because doing a provincial map with neighborhood detail is very tricky. We used a lot of insets, trying to summarize the whole province in 4 maps. So this is kind of stuff I would do. At this point, does anyone have any questions? I know I'm kind of zooming through this. You all seem to be smiling, so cool. Please just put up your hand at any time. I'm happy to answer questions. This was actually dental decay data, not the early childhood vulnerability data. They also did surveys of children's teeth and looked at how many kids had cavities. So you'd never think of mapping that. It would normally just be like in a report somewhere off in government documents. But instead you get this beautiful image and published it in several journals. We also did a lot of cool data visualization. So I just did a summary here of cartograms colored by vulnerability. One thing I experimented with was a bivariate choropleth map. You guys talked about these at all?
We didn't.
Okay, this is one of the hardest maps to interpret as a novice. But basically, if this is percent vulnerable, red is bad, green is good. If you then add the second dimension of the shading of the color, the intensity communicates the number of children. So just like that cartogram showed the number by size, this shows the number by intensity. So it didn't end up working very well. People were confused, but I just thought I'd show it for creativity. Another way to show number and color at the same time is by 3D extrusion. And it's super easy. You just use ArcGIS export to KML tool and extrude it by a height, and it creates an interactive map in Google Earth. So if you want to impress someone, that's a cool way to do it. The other thing we did was trends over time, so embedding bar charts. I actually created little charts attached to points directly in ArcGIS, so if you want to show this on your final project, that's something cool you could do. Or just simple overlays of many different maps. What you're getting at, though, is there's one data set, and we're showing it in probably 15 different ways. Another cool thing we did was looking at, this is a different data set, but looking at the relationship between grade 4 school readiness, sort of basically the assets that build up a community, things that children need to be successful. And the idea was use a symbol to show dark is good, fertile soil where the kids are going to thrive, and then light is more like the desert, there's challenges there. We also did pie charts and cartograms. This is, probably Dawn knows cartograms better than anyone. She's made many more than I, but basically the size shows the number of children in the school district and the color shows the percentage change. So are they shrinking or growing over time? And last but not least, we made a bunch of census maps as well. You can see I've used that ecumene basically to hide all the data from the empty space, and it gives you a much better picture of what the geography of the southeast or southwest Vancouver or southwest BC looks like. So lots of
So
colors.
different than regular census maps.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to Census StatsCan website,
So
they're like,
much more.
first of all, they're all projected wrong. They're all in a national projection, and like Vancouver's pointed out. So don't think that the StatsCan people are experts. Their job is to just get the data out, not to make it look pretty. All right, so now I'm just gonna continue on with a little journey. I made a few maps. These were just profs at UBC who approached me and said, I'm making a journal. Can you make me a map? I said, sure, it's $300. course declared on your other income box, but this is just what, someone wanted this figure for a journal. So thinking about, talking to them and saying, does it need to be black and white? What's the size the journal is going to print it? Will it have a title on the figure, or will the title be below the figure? You need to think about these things in advance, because when it gets to the printer and you have to take, the title is printed on the map, and you realize it's wrong, you kind of get stuck, and so you have to think through the end product. This is another kind of cool data set. We got basically some survey data on where children in these northern communities were hanging out, and they wanted to see if the only place in town you could buy condoms was directly across the street from where all the kids were hanging out after school. There was a lot of stigma attached to youth sexual health. So we were looking at the sort of hangout densities in these small towns where youth could access sexual health services. So we did this in black and white and color, and basically showed that the only hospitals or clinics were like where all the kids walked to school. So they actually changed it, and they put a clinic, a block, kind of around the block, where people wouldn't see people. Going on, more pie charts. This is some data on, we made about 80 maps for this atlas. It was kind of fun, but a lot of data. And the thing I wanted to highlight here, we looked at 10 different year brackets, and we used the same quintiles for all 10 years. And the goal was to show that as things changed over time, you could have a common quintile data set to compare your distribution against. So if we had changed the breakpoints on every map would look the same, because you'd have a high and a low. But the goal was to look at trends over time. So what we had to do was look at the aggregate of all the data for the 10-year period, determine quintiles based on that aggregate, and then as the distribution shifted through time, you saw the maps go from light to dark. It's basically just, if you're doing trend data, think very carefully about how things will look in the start and at the end. And you can show trend data also very well. You don't always need a map, so think about other charts and graphs you can add. Data tables also communicate a lot very quickly. Some other flow maps. This is where people were traveling to obtain abortions. It's quite a controversial data set, so you have to be very careful in presenting terminology and obviously protecting people's privacy. So we aggregated data to very large units of aggregation and never show things with less than 5 people. Ultimately, there's lots of maps here. I'm just going to skip through some of these. More contract work. All right, so urban planning and design. Any questions to this point? All good? Still with me? This is kind of the meat of what I want to talk about, so we've got about 20 minutes. I'll zoom through some of this. So, who wants to be an urban planner? Anyone here? All right. I am an urban planner. I say it, but I'm not really. I don't have certification yet. But these are the data sets that we work with in the urban planning business. So things like land use, what's allowed to be, basically where is the city growing, what's allowed to be built in different places. Zoning is what's physically allowed to be built today versus land use is what's going to be built potentially in the future. Transportation patterns, road network hierarchies, urban design, so that's often the finer scale details, like are there going to be parks with benches, or what's the streetscape like, what's the feel of the buildings next to the streets, where are parks going to go, how do we connect everything with trails, things like data sets like walkability, looking at population patterns. We use a lot of GIS analysis to do network, basically figure out proximity between things. Stormwater is a big thing that I'm gonna highlight a few maps from. And ultimately, a lot of our maps end up in the public's eye. Our goal is to communicate findings to public open houses often, so that's something to keep in mind. A lot of the more environmental research ends up in reports, so we don't have to be as weary of communicating simply. And the other thing I wanted to say is we do 3D visualization. It's not really cartography, but like creating a visual scenario of what a future looks like in a photograph sense. Um, so, like I said, population mapping. This is just population density. But if we're talking about the city of Vancouver, is it better to show this scale and give some context? Show this scale and give you a lot more detail with some nice labels on the roads, which obviously you can't see here. But, or zoom right in if you're doing a study on this park. Do you need to just maybe focus on that scale or even tighter? So getting your scale right from the start is quite important. And choosing colors that aren't offensive but give you a good, this is a divergent color scheme, which some people would say you should use a continuous scheme for a continuous data set like this, because there is no really, there's no reason why green should be low. The distinction I would say is that 0 is an important value because there's nobody there. Low density is often rural, which is kind of green in people's heads, and then high density is pink. So this is my favorite color scheme for population mapping.
So did you use the same classification for all three of those maps?
Yes, yeah.
Scales.
Just
So
different
just
scales.
like zooming in. So you might hand the client all three of those.
Yeah, in this
Which
case,
one they
these were
want to
developed
use.
just for a template. Kind of a proof of concept. We were developing a road, like a labeling protocol for different scales, so there would be scale dependency. So if we want to make a map for anywhere in the province, you just zoom to it, press print, go. And I haven't shown this before, but this is what a Boulder template looks like. There's always a legend here. There's always a lot of notes and technical references. Scale bar, title, or client name, title, and then there's always these little signatures. And basically, we have to keep on record a little like original file with people's signatures showing who reviewed it, who created it, who signed it, and then we're allowed to take the draft stamp off. Draft stamp is what saves us from being sued. So everything we do is always draft. We almost never publish final reports. It's like in all my jobs, probably it's just like the very last step. And a lot of things never get taken out of draft. It's kind of a funny trick we use, but legally it saves us a lot. So other things like using cartograms, this is employment density and population density. So we could look at the relationship between where jobs are and where people live. And the goal of this was to try to densify the downtown, so to communicate that the city of Squamish is very sprawled. We really wanted to concentrate future development in the downtown core. This is the new Boulder template. Just to show you, we kind of globally revised it, and this is the new one. And we just basically got rid of the box. This is like 100 people around the world working together for a year to come up with this. So it's kind of hilarious. I don't think it's the most beautiful map I've ever seen, but hey, you just kind of got to roll with it and not complain. Just use what they give you and try to make it better. So that's the zoom. But those are just some key elements that if you are a professional GIS or GIS professional, you'll have to learn to play by these rules. And there's always neat lines, there's notes, there's lots of junk on the map, but you just roll with it. Some park maps. This is Trout Lake. We're doing a master plan for there, looking at how to make it a better park. We're looking at where the park is in relation to other parks in the city, transportation networks. We're also developing a skate park and trying to do some community consultation, figuring out should we put the park here or here. And so maps are a great tool to just engage the public, collect feedback, and obviously you need to show things that are important. So greenways, transportation networks, SkyTrain. And I used a nice kind of gradient fill on the water just to give it that extra little bit of a pop. And that had to do in Illustrator. So
that's a great example of you're trying to show a particular piece of thematic data. You want to look at skate parks, but you really carefully chose other supporting thematic data and reference data. So you chose, okay, I want the roads.
yeah.
The roads are important. I want some blue lines. I want
But
some greenways. So
splitting the legend, it also helps because that's the first thing people look at. So they're not overwhelmed with this big legend.
Right.
And people intuitively know what a road is. But it's still important to show, because if someone at the open house goes, why is there no legend for the road? And start waving his cane. It happens. This is the same thing zoomed in with some data or just a base image. It's not my favorite map. It's a bit washed out, but when it's printed, it's easier to see. Land use planning, basically long-term planning. This is just some examples. We created this data from scratch. So it's literally I'm drawing the future city. Like I'm working with planners saying, okay, we're gonna create a residential neighborhood right here. And we're gonna expand that. It's kind of fun. Like I get to play urban planner. And maps then become legal documents, and this is developers invest millions of dollars based on these maps. So it's getting the line in the right place is very important. This is more land use mapping. One thing I didn't know when I started at this job, there are kind of like colors that people use for land use mapping. Basically, yellow shades or orange generally are showing residential areas. So it's really important. I always thought purple was residential. I just liked purple and used it on a lot of land use maps. But no, yellow means residential, red means commercial, greens are generally agriculture or park. That's kind of obvious. And then civic or institutional properties are often blue. And industrial is often purple. I showed it here as gray because there was so much of it. All of this would be purple and it would be overwhelming. But you'll see that those colors come up a lot, like here, residential.
Why was all of that industrial?
It's resource extraction. So it's almost like an ecumene in this case because there's nothing going on there. But using an inset to show the whole map and then detail is sort of a. And the other thing I like using a lot is trying to minimize the use of neat lines and borders. So nesting this border, you have to create a 4-point border on the actual map and then a 2-point border on the inset because the border on the outside will actually extend off the edge of the page. So that's kind of a neat trick if you're using snapping grids in ArcGIS and putting basically just making sure all the alignment's perfect and crisp.
It's also a great example of including scale bars, borders,
Yes.
different scales for different insets in the main map.
Yeah, because they're
Very clear
different.
about that.
I sometimes don't do that, but in this case, it was important. So trying to get rid of, you should have a neat line, but you should think about creative. You don't always need a black neat line. You don't always need like a neat line, then a white space, then another neat line. It's like, if you're projecting it, this is a neat line, but if I print it, this disappears. So there is actually a black border as well, but you can't see it here. So just thinking through how it's going to look in various projections. This was, in the end, they wanted more insets. So, you do what the client wants. It's a little bit overwhelming, but it's better to make one map than, there was 12 maps in this series. So if I'd made 6 maps times 12, there'd be 60 maps. It's ridiculous. So just making insets saved me a lot of work. This is just various things. We were looking at industrial land. Another land use map of the North Shore. This is for their official community planning process. So if you're in the planning business, this is like your bread and butter. This was a big poster that we had people drawing on. Then looking at development potential, basically saying what are you allowed to build, what's built today, and this is not the same place, but we did similar exercise in Coquitlam. This is what's there today, and this is what the future might look like. So this isn't cartography, but it's visualization, and this is an important thing to keep in mind if you're showing this, saying, look, you can build more in these blue areas. It communicates a certain thing, but if you're communicating it with a more powerful visual, that's another way of doing it. And this is just extruding polygons in KML, literally. It's kind of a neat trick. So some more land use maps, energy density, looking at greenhouse gas emissions for future and present. So this was, I wanted to communicate bad. I wanted high greenhouse gas emissions to be red, and I wanted green to be low. And then I also selected the color breaks to represent, basically so that the future would be substantially different than the present. So you're actually trying to create a bit of a story here, but not fudging it so much. You still want, I tend to use quintiles, but then round off to the nearest increment. So 5, 10, 15, 20, it's intuitive. People get that round number. If that was like 4.9, 10.2, it just confuses people. So think about those color classifications carefully. This is density. Instead of polygons, we just had different data. Agricultural maps. I'm just going to skim through a lot of these. Lots of land use mapping, value of land. I get to learn so many cool things every day. Like, I just go to work and I'm like, what am I going to make a map about? Soil. I had no idea how to make a soil map. Turns out soil has these crazy codes that represent like different elements and like the, I don't even know what they mean to be honest, but this is an official land use map that's in their community bylaws, and I just had to figure it out. So part of my job is just discovering, looking at examples, talking to other people. This was one of my favorite projects. We did a trail use master plan for District of West Kelowna. So these trails don't exist. They wanted to build trails, so they gave me a whole bunch of GPS data, and I had to create the trail map for the future and classify it all. So we had various trail types. Again, I use that hill shade. I go back and forth. I actually switched. Usually, the City of Vancouver one, I had the dark blue next to the shore. You kind of got to work with the map and see what looks best. This one, it's like deeper, so I wanted a deeper blue, but that's just personal preference often. And the other thing to keep in mind, if you were doing lots of maps, use data-driven pages. Probably learned that in Brian's class, but it's automation basically. You give it a set of features and it'll zoom through and make identical maps with different places. So this is all one map, but see the inset changing. It's just zooming to each trail segment and exporting it. So instead of having 6 MXDs, I have one. Very nifty trick. Makes us a lot of money. Some more, we mapped farmers markets, mapped survey responses. This is an interesting thing. If the client asks for a number of surveys collected per ward in Calgary, and as a cartographer I think, well, that's not really the best. You shouldn't just show raw numbers. So even though they didn't ask for it, I gave them one standardized by population because it tells a slightly different story. You're covering 1% of the population in the darkest areas. So that's kind of the better map, but they wanted both.
Did you consider using proportional circles for the
Oh, that's a good idea. So showing it as an overlay? Or
yeah, like showing the
total
circle
number.
size, showing the number, and then that's showing the rate.
That would be a good idea as well. Ultimately, I had no budget for this one, so sometimes I just need to do stuff. There's proportional symbols though. Population is a great way of doing it. So population in this one was total population, and then this one's for the population density. So it's similar. I could have overlaid them. The thing I did here was the client had a branding template, so I used their logo, used their branding, developed a template that sort of matched their look and feel. Sometimes people want a map that doesn't need to happen. This only has, count them, 1, 2, 3 places, 3 colors. You just do what you're asked. Sometimes, and it's important. They wanted to see those colors on a map, so just do it. This is the last project I'll show you in the urban planning segment, and then I think we've got 5 minutes left. This is stormwater management. So where are the pipes? Where are the watersheds? Neighborhood planning boundaries overlaid with the watersheds. This map's a lot to look at, so I'll skip it. This is land use for the City of Vancouver, or it's actually zoning. They don't have a land use bylaw. This was one thing I wanted to show you. I took off the neat line, and just that and I also added the water effect. But look at this extra neat line. It's not needed. So you take it off, and the whole map's just so much nicer.
Oh, makes a huge difference.
What's that?
Makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's just, you focus on the data instead of the heavy frame. Anyways, what we did was do aerial image classification to classify impervious surface, or basically hard surfaces that water does not go into the ground. And then we calculated the percentage of every single parcel in the city that is impervious. So this represents basically where water is going to run off and create stormwater problems versus where the water is going to infiltrate into the ground. I'm not a stormwater expert, but you can, this was about 40 hours of work to get to this point. So this map is $4,000.
What was with the excluded area?
Oh, that's a watershed that we were not going to look at. It's just part of the study.
But you have data for it.
I just calculated it because I knew eventually they might want it.
Yeah.
So I did it.
And then
Often people say they don't want something and then they're like, oh, can you just add that park in? And then you have to go back to the very beginning. So I just usually include it all. Okay, 2 more sections. Environmental assessment. This is science. All this stuff was planned. This is quantifying destruction of the environment. And I'm a passionate environmentalist, and I feel like my job is protecting the environment, but we also have to measure the impacts and offset them. So these are just some of the areas that we look at. One of the coolest things I got to do was go into the field, collect GPS points for trees along this pipeline, but it's water pipeline. So how does that change your impression of a pipeline? Oil pipeline, water pipeline, they have the same environmental impact at a local scale. And actually, if water leaches into the river, it'll kill fish because the chlorine kills the fish. So just something to think about. I know pipelines are a hot topic. One of the things I did was put photos directly in the map. And then these are the trees that I looked at and how the pipeline is going to interact with the trees. And I also used data-driven pages on this one. So it's one map, 3 different places. Some other residential developments. Aquifers. Again, I don't know much about aquifers, but they really wanted all these colors. So I had to use a little more of a divergent color scheme just to show the difference. And again, this was 2 seasons. They wanted the same color breaks, but they basically, in the dry season, there's very little water. The wet season, there's a lot. So I set up the breaks to be representative of both data sets. Base map, giving some elevation for a watershed. Some more climate change, showing change present versus future. And this is a liquid natural gas export plant. Very hot topic in BC right now. Basically, this is the place, this is the context. So it's really important to understand the local area. If I were to cut this map off here, everyone would say, well, what about the rest of Howe Sound? So you have to kind of think through what the audience wants to see on the map. Show enough context to make it meaningful. Sneak Vancouver in there for reference. Shipping routes. This kind of, I designed it to look like a chart, so it's kind of got that more, the water has the depth shown. And that's just an ESRI base map. You can click Add Base Map, plus button, pre-configured base map, and then get, this is the ocean base map. I use it for a lot of projects. Sort of detailed more like an engineering drawing. I do this a lot for energy and mining projects. So this you have to be super technical and think about labeling and the detail. It's not so much important to make it look pretty, but you still want to get good contrast and show color. Fisheries maps. Could have been 4 maps, but I made it 1 because why have 4 when you can have 1? Then the public wanted an open house map. So they don't need that like standard Boulder frame. So we created this just as kind of a nice, simple overview map. Alright, so Healthy City. This is my blog. I'm going to show you a few cool maps. For Valentine's, I had to make a special map. So this is just population, cartogram, but I just made hearts and called it number of hearts. There's 1 per person. This is all online, so if you want to look at my blog, there's lots of text about it. And there's some transportation data. Long commutes. I wanted to communicate that long commutes are bad, so I was very intentional and used bright red.
That are mapping census data or national NHS
NHS.
data for your final projects. You might want to look at some of these.
This is NHS data. And I added the SkyTrain network because it's really relevant to commuting. Commuter flows. Kind of looked at them individually and then in aggregate. It's where people walk versus where they take bikes. I did a Walkability Index. I'm presenting at the Esri User Conference in San Diego in a few weeks, or month. So I'm going to present this. It's got a lot of work to do. And my running, just my life is maps, so I just communicated that. This is where I run. And this was what I wanted to show you about color and contrast. Dark on a projector. So black on a projector disappears, but the color is popping out. So I designed this for monitors. And it was basically, I wanted the color to pop. This is some garden maps, mapped every garden in the city. This is my community garden. That's my plot. So kind of fun to be able to use maps in your life. And some $1 million homes. You may have seen this. I made my own version. And look at how just adding one more color break changes the map. All that red wasn't showing up on this map, so I remade it. And now that Shaughnessy area is dark.
So how powerful different classifications can be.
Yeah, it changes the entire message of the map. Household values, again, extruded. And this was the one map, I think Dawn, the reason I'm here today, she saw this map and said, Anthony, come talk to us. I just wanted to communicate some data on streetlight density. It's a meaningless map, I made it for fun. And, basically Granville is very bright. But the thing I wanted to communicate here is I used a very dark shade of blue, dark green, dark purple, and it's that same thing, creating a hierarchy through color and really emphasizing yellow is what pops.
Yeah, contrast and hierarchy is another one.
So I know I don't have time to look at your maps. I'm sorry. I really did want to collect them. I think I overestimated how long that would take. And that's where you can get in touch with me.